On a Tuesday morning in March of 1985, a Grundy County sheriff nailed a foreclosure notice to the front door of the Linden farm, the same door that Kenneth Linden's grandfather had hung in 1919, and drove away without looking back. The notice was printed on yellow paper. It gave the Lindens 30 days to vacate. It listed a debt of $214,000 on 480 acres of land that had been worth $2,100 an acre 4 years earlier and was now worth less than $900. It did not mention the 4 generations that had lived there. It did not mention the children's names carved into the barn door. It did not mention that Kenneth Linden had done everything his banker told him to do. It was the 4th foreclosure in the township that spring. It would not be the last. The agricultural credit system that had built modern Iowa farming was, by 1985, the most efficient machine for destroying it. To understand what happened, you need to understand how the system worked and how it broke. In the 1970s, American agriculture had entered a golden age. The Soviet Union was buying American grain. Commodity prices doubled between 1973 and 1974. Corn that had sold for $1.12 a bushel in 1970 was selling for $3.50 by 1974. Soybean prices hit $12 a bushel, unthinkable a decade earlier. Land values followed. Iowa farmland climbed from $419 per acre in 1970 to $2,147 per acre by 1981. Every chart pointed up. Every banker smiled. The Farm Credit System, the government-sponsored network of lending institutions created to serve agriculture, had $80 billion in outstanding loans by 1983. Rural banks competed for farm customers. In some counties, loan officers drove to farmhouses uninvited, knocked on doors, and asked if the family could use more credit. The money was there. The rates were low. The land was rising. To not borrow was to leave money on the table. The system encouraged a specific behavior. Borrow against your land to buy more land. Use the new land as collateral to borrow more. Expand. Mechanize. Buy the new John Deere 4840, $58,000. Buy the new combine, $95,000. Buy the neighbor's quarter section when he retires. The loans were secured by land values that everyone believed would never fall. Then 3 things happened in sequence, and each one made the next one worse. First, in December of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. President Carter responded with a grain embargo, cutting off American grain exports to the USSR. Exports dropped 20% overnight. Corn prices began to fall. Second, in October of 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to fight inflation. The prime rate climbed from 6.8% in 1976 to 15.3% in 1980 to 21.5% by June of 1981. A farmer who had borrowed $200,000 at 8% in 1977 was now paying 18%. His annual interest bill had more than doubled, from $16,000 to $36,000 on the same loan. Third, land values collapsed. Iowa farmland fell from $2,147 per acre in 1981 to $787 per acre by 1986, a drop of 63% in 5 years. The collateral that secured every loan in the county was melting. The dominoes fell. Banks demanded additional collateral that farmers didn't have. Farmers couldn't sell land to pay debt because land prices were falling. They couldn't earn their way out because commodity prices were below the cost of production. They couldn't refinance because no bank would lend against declining collateral. By 1984, U.S. farm debt had reached $215 billion. 19% of American farmers held 63% of that debt. In Iowa alone, $17 billion was owed. 300,000 farms would be lost nationwide by the end of the decade. 62 agricultural banks failed in 1985 alone, more than half of all bank failures in America that year. A loan officer from the Grundy National Bank sat in his office in the winter of 1985, looking at a stack of foreclosure files on his desk, and said something that nobody in the building wanted to hear. "We were lending against the value of the dirt," he said, "not the value of the crop. When the dirt lost its price, there was nothing underneath." That's when a rusted 1972 Ford F-100 with a dented tailgate and a Grundy County Co-op bumper sticker from 1969 pulled into the gravel lot at the Linden foreclosure auction and parked at the far end, away from everyone else. The driver didn't get out right away. He sat in the cab for a moment, watching the crowd gather, the neighbors, the bankers, the auctioneer setting up his portable PA system on the front lawn of a farmhouse that had been in one family for 66 years. Let me tell you about Harold Sievert, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he didn't do. Harold Sievert was 67 years old and had farmed 340 acres in Grundy County, Iowa, for 41 years. He had come home from Korea in 1953 with a Purple Heart and a limp that got worse in January, married a woman named Doris who kept the books in a spiral notebook and never rounded up, and taken over his father's farm the year Eisenhower ended the war. Harold was not a man who went to the bank. He was not a man who read the farm credit brochures or attended the expansion seminars at the county extension office. He was a man who sat at the kitchen table every Saturday morning with a cup of coffee and a cigar box full of receipts and counted every dollar his farm had earned and every dollar it had spent, and the number at the bottom of the page, the number that told him what he owed the world, had been the same for 41 years. 0. He had never borrowed a dollar in his life. He paid cash for seed. He paid cash for fertilizer. He paid cash for diesel. He paid cash for the 1968 John Deere 4020 he was still running in 1985. $5,800 at the dealer in Waterloo, paid with a check drawn on an account that had no loan attached to it. His neighbors financed $58,000 tractors, $95,000 combines, and $400,000 land purchases. Harold's combine was a 1971 John Deere 6600 that he had rebuilt with parts from a salvage yard in Cedar Falls. His corn planter was older than some of his neighbors, and in a county where the average farm debt was approaching $163 per acre, Harold Sievert owed nothing on 340 acres. Harold's father, Oscar Sievert, had learned about debt the way a man learns about fire, by being burned. In 1922, Oscar had bought 280 acres in Grundy County at $162 per acre, $45,360, financed with a $30,000 loan from the First National Bank of Grundy Center. It was the year Warren Harding was president, and corn was selling for $2 a bushel, and everyone in Iowa believed the boom would last forever. It didn't. Corn prices collapsed to 42 cents a bushel by 1932. Land values fell 70%. Oscar couldn't make his payments. The bank foreclosed in 1928. Oscar lost everything: the land, the house, the equipment, the milk cows his wife had raised from calves. Let me tell you about what Oscar did next, because it's the real heart of this story. He spent 6 years working as a hired hand on other men's farms, living in other men's houses, eating at other men's tables, driving other men's tractors. He saved every dollar. In the spring of 1934, the year the Dust Bowl reached its peak and nobody in America wanted to buy farmland, Oscar Sievert walked into the county courthouse and bought 340 acres at a tax sale for $18 an acre. He paid $6,120 in cash, every penny of it earned with his hands on someone else's land. He never borrowed again. Not a dollar. Not for seed, not for equipment, not for the house he rebuilt with lumber he cut himself. He paid cash or he didn't buy. "The bank doesn't care about your corn," Oscar had told Harold when Harold was 16, standing in the machine shed watching his father repair a harness by lantern light. "The bank cares about your land, and the day you put your land on a piece of paper and hand it to a man in a suit, it's not your land anymore, it's his. You're just the one doing the work." Harold heard that sentence once. He remembered it for the rest of his life. Let me tell you about Harold's John Deere 4020, because it's the symbol of everything Harold believed. The 4020 was built in 1968, the same year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and men orbited the moon. It was a 91-horsepower diesel tractor, the most popular tractor John Deere ever made. Harold bought it new for $5,800 cash. By 1985, it had 14,000 hours on the engine. The paint was faded from green to a pale olive. The seat had been recovered twice with duct tape and canvas. When the 4440 came out in 1978, 130 horsepower, $38,000, every farmer in Grundy County traded up. When the 4640 came in 1979, 155 horsepower, $45,000, the ones who hadn't traded yet did. When the 4840 arrived in 1980, 180 horsepower, $58,000, the last holdouts signed the loan papers and drove their new tractors home. Every farmer in the county bought a new tractor on credit. Every farmer except Harold Sievert. He hadn't complained when the dealer called him a holdout. He hadn't complained when his neighbor pointed at the 4020 and said, "That thing belongs in a museum." He hadn't even complained when the county assessor noted that his equipment age suggests deferred investment, a polite way of saying Harold was falling behind. He just changed the oil in the 4020 every 250 hours, replaced the injectors every 3,000 hours, and kept farming. Tom Driscoll was the most vocal critic. Tom was 44 years old in 1978, the senior loan officer at Grundy National Bank, and a man who believed, genuinely, deeply, that the way to help farmers prosper was to help them grow. He had processed $14 million in agricultural loans that year alone. He had a framed certificate from the Farm Credit Council on his office wall. He wasn't a bad man. He was a man who confused the direction of a trend with the nature of reality. "Harold, you're leaving money on the table," Tom said at the bank one afternoon in the spring of 1978, loud enough for the 3 other farmers in the lobby to hear. Harold had come in to deposit a check, not to borrow. "I've got farmers half your age farming 3 times your acreage. The rates are good. The land is there. Dennis Linden just picked up 240 acres across the road from you. That could have been yours, Harold. But you'd rather sit on 340 acres and drive a tractor from the Johnson administration." The lobby laughed. Someone said, "Harold's the smallest farmer in the township. He's making small look like a religion." The name stuck. Within a week, everyone at the Grundy Center grain elevator knew about the small man. Within a month, it had become a running joke at the co-op, at the implement dealer, at the Lutheran church coffee hour. Harold didn't respond. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to explain what his father had taught him about the difference between owning land and owing on land. He just took his deposit receipt, folded it into his shirt pocket, and drove home in the 1972 Ford with the dented tailgate. The next morning, he walked his fence line the way he did every morning, and the number at the bottom of the page was still 0. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been the only person in the room who said no? Not because you didn't understand the opportunity, but because you understood the risk that nobody else was willing to talk about. Have you ever watched everyone around you get bigger, get richer, get louder, buying new trucks, building new barns, adding new acreage, and felt the pull of it? The voice that says you're falling behind, that you're being left out, that your caution looks like cowardice? Have you ever had to choose between what the numbers say is smart and what your father's voice says is safe, and chosen the voice, knowing you might be wrong, knowing you might spend the rest of your life as the small man, the holdout, the one who didn't grow? Harold Sievert had that certainty. He had it because his father had lost a farm, rebuilt a life with his hands, and passed down a single sentence that was worth more than any loan. The bank doesn't care about your corn. "Harold, you don't understand how leverage works," Tom had said one afternoon in 1979, leaning across his desk at the bank. Harold had come in to buy a certificate of deposit, putting cash into savings while his neighbors were pulling cash out in loans. If you buy 160 acres at $2,000 an acre, that's $320,000. You put 20% down, you borrow $256. Land goes up 10%, that's $32,000 in equity. Your return on your $64,000 down payment is 50%. That's the power of leverage. Harold looked at the certificate of deposit form he was filling out. He didn't look up. "What happens if the land goes down 10%? Harold said. Tom smiled. "Harold, Iowa farmland hasn't declined in value since 1960. "It declined in 1921, Harold said. "It declined in 1930. "It declined every year until 1941. "That was the Depression. "It was a Tuesday," Harold said. "Same as today. The calendar didn't know it was a depression until later." Tom's smile got smaller. Those were different times. "The math isn't different," Harold said quietly. "If you borrow against something whose price can fall, you don't own it. It owns you. My father learned that in 1928. I learned it from him." The science behind what Harold understood is the foundation of this entire story. Collateral-based lending is a system that works beautifully in rising markets and catastrophically in falling ones. When a bank lends money secured by land, the loan amount is tied to the land's appraised value, typically 70 to 80%. As long as land values rise, farmers can borrow more, expand more, and service their debt with rising equity. The system feeds itself. More lending drives more land purchases, which drives up prices, which justifies more lending. But the system has a fatal flaw. It is a circle, not a foundation. When any external force breaks the circle, falling commodity prices, rising interest rates, declining exports, land values fall, collateral shrinks, and banks demand repayment that farmers cannot provide, because the same market conditions that reduced their collateral also reduced their income. It is the same mechanism that would cause the housing crisis in 2008, 30 years later, in a different market, with the same math Harold's father had lived through in 1928. Between 1981 and 1986, Iowa farmland lost 63% of its value. A farmer who had borrowed $200,000 against land worth $320,000 in 1981 now owed $200,000 against land worth $120,000. He was underwater, not because he farmed badly, but because the number on a piece of paper in a bank vault had changed. The math was merciless. If corn sold for $2.40 a bushel, and it cost $2.15 a bushel to grow, a farmer with no debt could clear 25 cents per bushel, thin but survivable. But a farmer with $163 per acre in debt was paying an additional $29 per acre per year in interest alone at 18%. That 25-cent per bushel profit was gone before the seed was in the ground. He was farming to pay interest. And when the interest exceeded the income, the bank sent a letter. And when the letter went unanswered, the sheriff came with a nail and a piece of yellow paper. Harold Sievert had no number on any piece of paper in any bank vault. His land was worth whatever the market said it was worth, $2,147, or $787, or $18. And it didn't matter, because nobody could take it from him. His cost of production was his cost of production. Nothing more. No interest, no principal, no letter. Let me tell you about what happened in Grundy County between 1982 and 1985, because that's the scene I want you to see. The crisis didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like winter, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. In the fall of 1982, the first letters came, white envelopes from the bank, addressed to farmers who had never received anything from the bank except deposit slips and Christmas cards. The letters used words like review and adjusted collateral requirements and supplemental security. They meant, your land is worth less than we thought, and we need you to put up more. In the spring of 1983, the first farm went to auction. The Wilkin Place, 320 acres, 3 miles south of Grundy Center. The family had farmed it since 1946. They owed $190,000 on land now appraised at $140,000. The bank called the loan. The auction drew 40 people who stood in the mud and watched the auctioneer sell a man's life one lot at a time. In the winter of 1984, 3 more farms went. The Novak Place, the Schaefer Place, the Paulson operation, 640 acres, the biggest in the township, financed to the hilt with a $410,000 operating loan and a $280,000 real estate mortgage. Gone in an afternoon. Harold drove past these farms on his way to town. He watched the signs go up. For sale, bank owned, auction, Saturday, 10 a.m. He watched the lights go out in the farmhouses. He watched the yards go to weeds. He watched the machinery sit in the mud, unsold, because nobody had money to buy it. The sound of the crisis was not a crash. It was silence. The silence of a tractor that didn't start on Monday morning because the farmer who drove it was gone. The silence of a grain dryer that sat empty in November because there was no crop to dry. The silence of a kitchen where a family used to eat breakfast at 6 o'clock, and now there was nobody at the table. By the spring of 1985, 11 of the 18 farms in the township had changed hands, been foreclosed, or were in the process of being sold under pressure. The township that had once been home to 18 families now had 7. Every farm in the township had debt. Every farm, except Harold Sievert's. His lights were still on. His tractor still started. His kitchen table still had a cigar box of receipts on it every Saturday morning. His fence line was still walked every day. The 4020 was still running. Tom Driscoll drove past Harold's place one evening in February of 1985 and noticed the light in the machine shed. Harold, doing something to the 4020 the way he always did. The same tractor, the same farm, the same 340 acres. Tom's smile, the easy, confident smile of a man who had processed $14 million in farm loans, had been gone for 2 years. Tom Driscoll called Harold in June of 1985. He asked him to come to the bank, not to borrow. Tom knew better than that. To talk. Harold sat across from Tom's desk in the same chair where he had filled out certificate of deposit forms for 20 years. The office looked different now. The Farm Credit Council certificate was still on the wall, but the stack of files on Tom's desk was taller, and each file had a yellow tab that meant the same thing. "Harold," Tom said. His voice was quieter than Harold had ever heard it. "The Linden Quarter section is going to auction next month. 160 acres. Good land. You know that ground. It's going to go cheap. Maybe 800 an acre?" Harold said nothing. 5 years ago, that land was 2,100, Tom said. "This is an opportunity, Harold." Harold looked at Tom for the first time. His eyes were calm. His face showed nothing but the patience of a man who had been sitting on the other side of this desk for 41 years. "It's an opportunity because Kenneth lost everything," Harold said. "His kids grew up on that land. I won't call it an opportunity." Tom's face went through several expressions. Discomfort. Something like shame. Then something else. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding a thing he should have understood 7 years ago. "Will you be at the auction?" Tom asked. "I'll be there," Harold said. "But not because you told me to." He stood up, put on his cap, and walked out of the bank the same way he had walked in. Slowly, steadily, owing nothing. The Linden foreclosure auction was held on a Saturday morning in July of 1985. The auctioneer set up his PA system on the front lawn of the farmhouse, the same lawn where Kenneth Linden's daughters had played in the sprinkler every summer. The sky was overcast. The air was heavy with humidity and the smell of cut grass that nobody had bothered to maintain. 43 people came. Some were farmers looking to buy. Most were neighbors who came to watch, the way people slow down for an accident, not wanting to see it, unable to look away. The auctioneer started with the equipment. A 1978 John Deere 4440 with 6,200 hours. The tractor Kenneth had bought on credit for $38,000 in 1979. It sold for $11,500. A 1981 John Deere 7720 combine, purchased for $95,000, sold for $22,000. A grain cart, a planter, a disc. Piece by piece, a farm was dismantled and sold to strangers. Then the auctioneer moved to the land. 160 acres, Section 14, Lincoln Township, Grundy County, he said. Surveyed and clear. No encumbrances. Opening bid is $600 per acre. Silence. Harold stood at the back of the crowd. He wore the same faded jacket he always wore, the same cap, the same boots. He did not look at anyone. 600, the auctioneer repeated. A man from Tama County raised his hand. 600. 650, someone else said. The bidding moved in small increments. $650. $700. $725. $750. The numbers crept upward the way a thermometer moves in January. Slowly, reluctantly, each degree harder than the last. At $775, the bidding slowed. At $790, it stopped. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then Harold raised his hand. 800, he said. His voice was calm and clear. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a number from a man who had been counting numbers every Saturday morning for 41 years and knew exactly what he could afford. The auctioneer looked at him. 800 to the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 810? Silence. 800 going once. Silence. 800 going twice. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The crowd stood in the humid July air and watched a 67-year-old man in a faded jacket buy 160 acres of Iowa farmland with money he had earned by spending 41 years saying no. Sold. $800 per acre. 160 acres. Total, $128,000. Harold walked to the auctioneer's table. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a personal check, already written. He had filled it out that morning at the kitchen table, next to the cigar box of receipts. He signed it, handed it over, and put his cap back on. $128,000. Personal check. No loan application, no collateral review, no bank officer's signature. Just the savings of a man who had never owed a dollar to anyone. Every person at that auction had watched a farm die. Every person had watched the numbers fall and the files grow and the signs go up along the gravel roads. Every person had wondered who would be next. Every person except the one who had never been at risk. His face was calm, but there was something in his eyes, not triumph, not satisfaction, something closer to grief. He was buying his neighbor's land. The neighbor's children had carved their names in the barn door on that land. The neighbor had done everything the bank told him to do. Harold did not look at the crowd. He did not smile. He walked back to his truck, got in, and drove home. Tom Driscoll stood at the edge of the crowd, watching Harold's truck disappear down the gravel road. The yellow foreclosure files on his desk back at the bank would keep growing through the fall. 62 agricultural banks would fail that year, more than half of all bank failures in America. Tom's face showed nothing. There was nothing left to show. Let me tell you about what those numbers meant, because that's the part most people never hear. Harold Sievert's farm in 1985. 340 acres, plus 160 acres newly purchased. Total, 500 acres. Total debt, $0. Annual interest cost, $0. Cost of the new land, $800 per acre, paid in cash. Kenneth Linden's farm in 1985. 0 acres. Remaining debt after foreclosure sale, $86,000. The difference between what he owed and what his land and equipment sold for. Kenneth moved his family into a rented house in Grundy Center and took a job at the grain elevator for $7.50 an hour. He was 46 years old. The Paulson operation, 640 acres, foreclosed, sold in pieces. Carl Paulson's total debt at time of foreclosure, $690,000. His debt-to-asset ratio had reached 115%. He owed more than he owned. Carl and his wife moved to Waterloo, where Carl found work at a John Deere plant that was laying off workers by the thousands. Across Grundy County, the average farm that had expanded during the 1970s carried $163 in debt per acre. Harold carried 0. The average farm was paying $29 per acre per year in interest alone, before seed, fertilizer, diesel, or equipment costs. Harold's interest cost was 0. In a year when corn sold for $2.40 a bushel, and the cost of production was $2.15, the difference between survival and foreclosure was not yield or weather or skill. It was the number on the line that said debt. Tom Driscoll drove out to Harold's place on a Saturday morning in October. The harvest was in. The 4020 was parked in the machine shed with the hood up. Harold was changing the oil, the way he did every 250 hours. The new 160 acres stretched to the east, freshly combined, the stubble golden in the autumn light. Tom got out of his car and stood at the edge of the driveway. He didn't go to the machine shed right away. He stood for a moment, looking at the farm. The small farm, the quiet farm, the farm that owed nothing. He walked over. Harold didn't look up from the oil drain. "Harold," Tom said, "I remember the day you came into the bank in '78, and I said you were leaving money on the table. I said you were afraid." Harold wiped the dipstick with a rag and slid it back in. "I wasn't afraid, Tom," Harold said. "I remembered." Tom didn't ask what Harold remembered. He knew. Everyone in Grundy County knew the story of Oscar Sievert by now, the man who lost a farm in 1928 and spent 6 years rebuilding from nothing. The story that had seemed like ancient history in 1978 and felt like prophecy in 1985. "I'm sorry," Tom said. Harold looked at Tom for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Come inside," Harold said. "Doris has coffee on." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Harold counted his receipts every Saturday. The cigar box was in its usual place. The spiral notebook was next to it. The number at the bottom of the page was still 0. Outside, the 4020 sat in the machine shed with fresh oil and 14,000 hours on the clock. The new 160 acres stretched east to the section road. The corn stubble was golden in the late October light. It was a small farm, 500 acres in a county where the survivors would soon consolidate into 1,000-acre operations. But it was a farm that existed because one man had said no when saying yes was easier, more profitable, and more popular. In 1986, Congress introduced Chapter 12 bankruptcy to help farm families restructure their debt. In 1987, the government bailed out the farm credit system with $4 billion. The crisis eventually ended, not because the math changed, but because the people who were most leveraged were already gone. The farms that remained were the farms that had either restructured their debt or never had any. The following year, 2 more farmers in the township asked Harold how he had done it, how he had survived when everyone else went under. Harold's answer was always the same. It wasn't about the 4,020, or the small acreage, or the salvage yard parts. It was about the line on the page. The line that said what you owed. He didn't owe anyone. That was the whole point. This story draws from real agricultural history of the 1980s farm crisis, the Federal Reserve's interest rate policies under Paul Volcker, the collapse of Iowa farmland values, and the foreclosure of approximately 300,000 American farms during the decade. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling. Did your family lose a farm in the 1980s? Or keep one? What decision made the difference? Tell us in the comments.